All right. Well, it is now exactly 6 o'clock. So we will get started with our panel. Uh, First of all, a huge thanks and a big welcome to everyone who's joining us from around the world. This is very much a first attempt at this, and a number of us are technologically challenged, so please bear with us. Uh, I'm Dino Martins. I'm the director of Impala. I'm joined today by Papa Hornbill, who's over here. I'll have to go inside in a minute, but we're really, really honored today to be able to listen to three amazing scientists who work at Impala. And for those of you who are not familiar with Impala, Impala is a field research center, a living laboratory out here in northern Kenya on the Laikipia Plains. And Impala welcomes scientists and students from around the world. And normally now we'd be full with scientists and students. Unfortunately, due to the crisis facing the world, we are not able to do that in person, but we do have a lot of research continuing. And Impala's been in existence for the last 25 years. Impala is made up of a partnership between a number of institutions, the Smithsonian Institution and Princeton University, as well as the Kenya Wildlife Service and the National Museums of Kenya, along with the Impala Wildlife Foundation. And we're really thrilled this evening that you're able to join us. And so welcome to everyone. We're going to be hearing about some recent work that's been published in Nature Sustainability by Dr. Judith Sitters, Dr. Duncan Kimuyu, and Professor Truman Young, all of whom have worked at Impala for varying periods of time, but Professor Truman has been involved in Impala from the very beginning. And so we're really, really thrilled to have them with us. We'll be hearing from them. You can ask questions. We have a lot of people participating and we've received a lot of questions. So we probably won't be able to get to all of them in the time we have, but we will try and follow up with you by email if you have some specific questions. So greetings again from Impala. Welcome, and welcome to Truman. Karibuni.
All right. So, one of the things that's really special about Impala specifically, and Laikipia in general, is that it still has this combination of wildlife and livestock that is becoming less sustainable or less common worldwide. There's evidence that in Laikipia there have been pastoralists for thousands of years, and we know that 150 years ago, when Europeans showed up in East Africa, they found a landscape full of wildlife and full of cattle. This relationship clearly suggests there is some way for these things to coexist, but that has become less common as we create areas that are just wildlife, like the national parks, and areas outside the national parks where cattle have become so abundant that there's less wildlife. So one of the things that we're looking at in Impala is whether or not that balance can be reestablished or better understood at the very least. And that's hampered by the fact that there's been very little research on that question. Most wildlife research happens in national parks in areas devoid of livestock. So this is a little intro slide about the experiment that we've been carrying out at Impala for the last 25 years. For those of you who are less aware of the location, Kenya lies right on the equator, as does Laikipia within Kenya. You can see in the lower left panel the location of Impala Ranch in the Laikipia Plateau, which is a high, dry plateau about 2,000 meters that lies in the rain shadow of Mount Kenya, meaning it's drier than some of the areas around it. The experiment that I'll be talking about, that we will be talking about today, occurs in a part of Laikipia and Impala dominated by Acacia drepanalobium wooded grassland. This is a savanna dominated by the whistling thorn. And so let me just describe to you what this experiment does. What we did is we decided to create pieces of the landscape that had to which different combinations of large mammalian herbivores, wild and domestic, had access. And we did this through a series of different kinds of barriers. Here's a picture of our main wildlife fence, multi-stranded electric fence, that keeps out all wildlife bigger than basically a steinbuck. Some of these areas have gates in them that we can allow cattle in or not. We also have these high electric fences, 2 high electric lines. These allow all wildlife to enter, come and go as they please, but do exclude elephants and giraffes, which we call megafauna in this experiment. And lastly, because cattle in Laikipia, as throughout Africa, are individually herded in herds of maybe 100 head by herders, we can determine where cattle go or don't go by cooperating with the local herders. And here's the design that we created. So each of these, there's 3 blocks here. Each has 6 squares. Each of those squares is 200 meters on a side. So that makes them 4 hectares, which is 10 acres. And in each of those squares, you can see some letters. Those letters represent which large herbivores are allowed into that piece of the landscape. So up here at the top, this MWC, that tells you that cattle and wildlife and mega herbivores are allowed into that piece of property. Right below it here, C is a property that is a plot that only cattle are allowed into. And you can see we have 6 different combinations of cattle, wildlife, and mega herbivores, one of which is this 0, meaning that none of the large herbivores, including cattle, are allowed in. And so we have these 6 different combinations. We've repeated that design 3 times to give us some statistical power to ask questions. And we've let that run for the last 25 years. Now, you can think of this experiment as those different plots as representing different management regimes in the region. Just say WC representing a WMW representing a nature reserve, C representing a cattle ranch that doesn't allow wildlife, and then MWC, a mixed use, and of course different other combinations. We can also think of this experiment as simulating extinction scenarios, and several researchers have taken that tack as well, where you have a full complement of wildlife, and then you may lose elephants first, and then you may lose other wildlife next, and then you may or may not add cattle in such a world. Conversely, this experiment is going to allow us to ask questions about rewilding and refaunation, a new idea in international conservation. By the way, in addition to the experiment design that I showed you, we've layered into it some additional embedded experiments that we won't be talking about today. We've done some controlled burns. We have areas of where grazing is at much higher levels, more similar to the pastoral lands around us. We've done some tree thinning experiments, and we're about to add a fertilization layer in little subplots within that design. And over the last 25 years, we've identified dozens of species interactions and different kinds of trophic cascades, some of which are illustrated here. Each of those arrows shows a causal relationship that we've identified. The directions of those areas, some in both directions, indicate the direction of that causal relationship. All those boxes in yellow are the things that we manipulate experimentally, and the rest are the cascading taxa that respond to those manipulations. But one specific area we'll be talking about today is the fascinating patterns that have begun to emerge about the relationship between livestock and elephants, our main mega herbivore in the plots and the main mega herbivore in Laikipia. And the kind of recurring theme through these studies is that elephants appear to mitigate, that means reduce, the effects of cattle in a variety of ways. For instance, cattle reduce grass cover because they eat it, and this leads to a suppression of wildlife who are competing for that grass cover. Both of these things, both of these effects of cattle are mitigated by elephants, and you're going to hear about that from Duncan Kamuyu. In addition, cattle reduce soil fertility and ecosystem nutrient levels, but elephants mitigate that effect, and you're going to hear about that from Judith Sitters. And lastly, cattle at high densities we know throughout Africa that really high levels of grazing can reduce woody encroachment, can increase woody encroachment of the landscape. And we know that elephants can reverse that. We won't be talking about that combination today unless you guys want to talk about it. So all of these patterns are in a landscape and in an experimental design where cattle are kept at moderate densities, probably similar to the kind of densities that they were at for the millennia leading up to the last couple hundred years. And so that's a qualification that needs to be said, although we are also testing the effects of more intense cattle densities as well. So with that, I think I will pass on to Duncan and let him take it from there.
All right, thank you, Truman, for that introduction. Building on what Truman was saying, it's true that we are seeing increasing livestock densities across the world, and also we are seeing a marked decrease in the densities of wildlife, and poses a question of what interactions exist in this system. And this has been my area of interest, looking at livestock-wildlife interactions and how various forces, such as fire and herbivory, shape these interactions. So one thing about livestock interactions, livestock and wildlife interactions, when we think about livestock and wildlife interactions, a lot of things come to us, and one of the things that will pop to our head immediately is what are the implications for the disease? What are the implications for livestock depletion? Of course, we'll have livestock, some carnivores, some predators taking part of the livestock, and also issues of competition that we think about pastures and potentially the ways in which when you put both together, you are likely to get into competition. And the last part is actually particularly interesting, considering the increase in populations of wildlife all around us. And that when it pushes, or when we exceed a certain level, then we start seeing aspects of land degradation. And it's important to think about these forces and how they operate. And one thing about Laikipia ecosystem is that we see these interactions happening side by side. We have cattle and wildlife grazing side by side, and therefore enough ground to enable us to mount these kind of experiments that tell us the nature of these interactions. And Mpala has provided the right platform for to be able to test such kind of interactions. So we've been looking at how cattle affect land use by all habitat use by various species of wildlife. And one of the key interesting findings is that, just as you may guess, in areas where you have cattle, you get less and less, or wildlife tend to avoid such areas. And we know this by looking at patterns in dung density, because dung can give us information on how much time animals spend in an area, and can also give us information on the number of animals that are actually spending and how much time they are spending in different plots. So in each of those clay plots, we've been able to monitor patterns of dung densities for various species of wildlife. And from that, we get almost a general trend. Wherever you have cattle, you get less wildlife, suggesting that there could be some form of competition happening. And consistent with that, we see less grass in plots that cattle graze. And even more important, we see less forbs in plots that cattle graze. And both of these different forms of herbaceous vegetation have different implications on the impact to wildlife. So perhaps the idea that cattle are suppressing different species of wildlife is not surprising, because we know it's because of interactions at level of reduction in forbs and at the level of grasses. But what we are seeing in this slide is that in plots where you have both cattle and mega herbivores existing, those are the plots in that slide denoted by MWC, the red plot. You see less reduction in the densities of wildlife, suggesting that for most species, when you put elephants as part of the equation, the impact of cattle are much less, or at sometimes even the impact or the negative impact of elephants or of cattle might be reversed. So this is actually interesting to wildlife managers. So for example, from the perspective of wildlife manager, it helps to understand that when cattle are grazing, or rather when elephants are grazing side by side with cattle, the impact of cattle are less. And this is just showing overall trends in all species of wildlife. And we think the patterns that we are seeing here, that mega herbivores are reducing the negative impact of cattle, are related to the idea that elephants, first thing, as Truman mentioned, is that they can control the densities of trees, and with less trees, you get more grass underneath, and that helps perhaps in mitigating the negative impact. And then another mechanism that we also didn't expect is that elephants, in the way they take forbs, in the way they reduce forbs, influences cattle behavior, such that if you have fewer forbs as a result of elephant grazing, whenever you bring cattle in the landscape, they take fewer grass, and therefore that sort of mitigates, or as a consequence, you have less grass left behind and more of the grazers. So yeah, I think that is important from the landscape perspective, and perhaps Judith can take over.
Do you guys see my screen? I don't see it myself anymore. Oh.
We can see your screen.
Do you see my presentation?
We do.
Okay, yeah, it's there now, right? Okay, well, thanks for the introduction, Dino, and thanks, Duncan and Truman, for your first presentation. So just first a short presentation of who I am. So my name is Judith Sidders, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher in Brussels, which is in Belgium. And my research mainly focuses on the impact that large mammalian herbivores have on soils and plants in grassland ecosystems. And these are actually, they could be all over the globe. So I work in African savanna, like the savanna at Mpala, but I've also worked in the Arctic tundra in Norway. They're focusing more on reindeer activities. So I'm especially interested in trying to figure out how herbivores change growth-limiting resources for plants. So especially how do they change nutrient availabilities for plants, such as nitrogen and phosphorus, which are very important nutrients for the growth of plants. So I'm quite fascinated by herbivore dung, because herbivore dung is actually an organic fertilizer for plants. And this is one of the pathways in which I study the impact that herbivores have on plant communities. And this, so this research actually brought me to Mpala and brought me to the Kenya long-term exposure experiment, which is of course an extremely famous experiment in savanna ecology. And we were very curious to actually find out what impact these different herbivore treatments would have on the storage of carbon and nutrients in the soil. So would there be a different impact in the livestock plots versus the wild herbivore plots, for example? So I came to Mpala and we collected a lot of soil samples, amongst other things, and we took a look at the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus concentrations in these soils. And this study was actually published in Nature Sustainability, as Dino mentioned, earlier this year, and this is our main result. So we have here 3 panels. Panel A is the total carbon pool. So here are the 6 different herbivore treatments, as Truman explained in his talk. We have the total nitrogen pool and the total phosphorus pool. And what becomes very clear immediately from this graph is that when you have cattle in your experimental plots, there is a decrease in soil carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus pools. And this decrease is quite significant. So this means that when I went to the Mpala plots, that was in 2015. So the experiment had been running for 20 years. And during these 20 years, cattle had been exporting plant carbon and plant nutrients outside of the experimental plots. And this is likely due to the way that they're being herded. So in most African, so East African and South African savannas, cattle are herded, they graze during the day in the savanna matrix, and then during night, they are enclosed in bomas or kraals or paddocks. There are different terms for this. And these are enclosures where the cattle are kept overnight and they are protected then from predators such as lions. So what cattle do is they graze during the day and then they deposit dung and urine during the night, mostly. So that means that there's an export from nutrients where they graze to the areas where they are enclosed overnight. And this is apparently also occurring in these experimental plots in the Klee. But the most surprising result we actually found, and this really indicates this extremely important impact of megaherbivores, is that when we had the MWC plots, so these are plots where cattle occurred together with megaherbivores and other wild herbivores, we actually found the highest carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus pools in the soil. So cattle are still present here. There is still this export going on, but apparently megaherbivores were really able to reverse this negative effect of cattle. And we think that they do this through 3 potential pathways, and some of them were also already touched upon by Duncan. So the first one is that indeed, when elephants have access to the plots, cattle slow down their foraging. And this is because elephants are eating away these protein-rich forbs. So cattle, they need more time to actually find the vegetation that they want to graze upon. So this means that they're exporting less carbon and nutrients outside of the experimental plots because they are basically grazing less in the plots where elephants also have access to. The second mechanism is that elephants are facilitating these other wild herbivores when cattle are present. So this means that there is a higher dung deposition in the plots by other wildlife species, which could increase carbon and nutrient pools in the soil. And the third one, which Duncan and Truman also mentioned, is that elephants are key ecosystem engineers. They topple trees. So in the clee plots where elephants have access, tree cover is much lower. And we have shown that the carbon in the soil represents the carbon of the trees. So this means that the carbon and the nutrient pools in the soil actually are transferred from trees that have been toppled by elephants. So this study actually again shows the importance of conserving mega herbivores, in this case elephants, in Laikipia and in other savanna ecosystems, because it does not necessarily need to be a bad thing to have cattle in your ecosystem as long as you keep your wild herbivore community intact and especially protect these mega herbivores, because if they are present, then they can mitigate or reverse the negative effect that cattle have. In terms, for example, in this case, in terms of carbon and nutrient sequestration in the soil. Yeah, those were my slides. So I'll just stop sharing.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Truman. Thank you, Duncan. And thank you, Judith. That was absolutely fascinating. And we have a ton of questions coming in. But I'll start off by maybe making a few comments and saying that, well, today we have over 400,000 elephants left on the African continent. They say for about 415,000. And Kenya's elephant population is about between 25 to 30,000. And here in Laikipia, there have been 2 recent censuses, and it showed the elephant population has grown by 12%. Now, some people say there actually may be too many elephants, and other people say, well, there's too few of them. And as you've pointed out, this is an amazing landscape because people, wildlife, and livestock have been sharing it for thousands and thousands of years. But that's changing, and it's changing really fast. We talked about rewilding, and I think that's something we should explore further. But I just wanted to throw this out there and see what the panelists thought. How, where, and when can we replicate this? And, if you don't have an elephant available to do some of this work, who else can do it? Truman, do you want to start, then Duncan, then Judith?
I don't know about where to find yourself some elephants, but this question of what's the future of these landscapes is also embedded in the very future of livestock economies in general. Many livestock economies are bare subsistence economies in a world that's rapidly developing, and it's not clear what's going to become of those kinds of economies as these countries have create economic structures that provide opportunities that are far more remunerative than having a small herd of cattle. We are already seeing shifts to large herds of cattle or ownership of cattle by wealthier people who nonetheless graze them in traditional ways in Kenya. And what opportunities that might provide in the future for different kinds of cattle densities and cattle-wildlife interactions is not yet clear. But clearly it's a rapidly changing socioeconomic landscape that we can only begin to anticipate how it will play out.
Thank you. Duncan, did you want to add something to that?
Your microphone is muted, Duncan. Yeah.
All right. I think in addition to what Truman is mentioning, it's very important to really understand dynamics of pastoralism, and from the perspective that pastoralism, as we know it, is based on, or rather, is firmly tied to culture of people, and we know culture is changing. It's of course changing, and people, of course, adjusting to the new realities of livelihoods. And it's possible that pastoralism as we know it is going to change a lot. And it's possible that with emerging patterns, that the future of these ecosystems, in the way that we have thought of them before, is likely to change. And we are seeing new scenarios where there are new emerging trends in terms of how people manage livestock in the land, already concerning areas of overgrazing and all that. And this is going to influence a lot how we see pastoralism and the sustenance of these ecosystems.
Thank you, Duncan. Judith, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the latter part of your question, talking about if you could replace elephants by something else. So, for example, elephants are a megaherbivore. There are other megaherbivores, such as rhinos and hippos, for example. I think giraffes are also considered megaherbivores. So, for example, white rhino are also key ecosystem engineers. So they also have a myriad of effects that trickle down to other consumers, to the vegetation, such as these elephant effects. It does remain that if elephants would disappear from a landscape, could you maybe replace them actually by, so if, for example, the toppling of trees is like the main mechanism by which they change things, would it be an option? So this is something that maybe Duncan and Truman also have an idea about, like, would it be an option to just have people cutting down more trees to, like, I know you cannot replace elephants by human activity, but there might be ways in which you could proxy the effect that they have. Of course, we wouldn't want to, because I think it is important to conserve these megaherbivores. But there might be ways that pastoralists could actually also mitigate the negative effect that their livestock might have by proxying elephant effects.
Just a quick note on that. We, of course, are aware that, as Truman pointed out in the beginning, this is a system where fire is a really important driver of vegetation cover. And fire has huge impact on trees. And one of the ancient tools that has been used in rangelands or in savannas is fire. And fire can, in a big way, control the intensities of trees. But then also a quick note to that is that even in our system, we are beginning to realize that it might actually take a combination of elephants and fire to knock down trees. So with just fire alone, you don't get as much impact as you get when you combine with elephants.
Thank you, Duncan. Truman, did you want to add anything to that before we go to our questions from the audience?
Well, I did know, so one of the questions of the audience relates to something Judith said, in that, when my experiment, this M is mega herbivores, and yet we talked mainly about elephant.
Yeah, elephant, yeah.
Giraffes are being excluded. We know that giraffes are having their own effects. We strongly suspect that many of the effects that we're attributing to mega herbivores are in fact elephants. And but giraffes do have certain traits like affecting tree densities that may parallel the elephant effects. And so that is certainly something to think about. Also, as you said, there are places that think they might have too many elephants. And in a changing landscape, one can imagine pastoral areas that want those elephants. If not right now, maybe not too distant future. That is certainly an optimistic view, but not an entirely unreasonable one.
Thank you. So we'll start on our questions here. And just before that, I just wanted to comment, when we're talking about tree turnover, these are thorny trees that are growing in the savannah, because some people might say, hey, don't you want to protect the trees? What happens if the elephants knock all of them down? Well, the key thing here is everything in moderation, and that's a theme both for livestock and wildlife, and that in these sophisticated and simple and amazing interactions that all these species have, the system remains dynamic, productive, and resilient. All right, so we're going to get going with the questions, and I'll let the panelists jump in as you want to. But basically, we have a lot more questions than we can probably answer in the time available, so we will try and follow up with you individually. So from Gwilly Gibbon at the University of Kent, he's asking about that high densities of cattle can increase woody plant cover. Could you explain a bit more about this?
If I could jump in, that we see actually worldwide. One of the main ways this happens is that that grasses and young trees and shrubs compete with each other, and it's that interaction that creates a savanna, which is this mixture of the two, this kind of a balance of those. If you have high cattle densities, they can reduce grass cover sufficiently that the woody plants are released from that competition. That's considered one of the main causes of bush encroachment. Also, as you reduce grass cover, the ability of the system to carry fire where it still occurs is reduced, and that will also encourage woody encroachment.
Yeah, and my recent research on herbivore dung actually shows that tree seedlings win competition with grasses if they're fertilized with dung from grazing animals, such as cows. So this could actually also play a role there. Cool.
Yeah, and if you think of it, even in terms of the fire dynamics, I like thinking about fire. With less grass, especially in some of the mesic savannas, you get, with less grass, you get less severe fires, which again could translate to higher seedling survival for trees, potentially adding up to the idea that if you have cattle on the landscape, you're going to get less severe fires, which again translates to better survival of trees, and therefore you could end up with a system that is encroached by woody species.
Thank you. We will go to the next question now. It's a question from Kiran Shah, who's asking about competition between cattle and wildlife, which you measured using dung density. Would the presence of humans, herders, be a factor? So how does the grazing system affect these results?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in there. That's always a question, is whether or not the wildlife is avoiding humans, and that's really what's happening, because these all herded cattle. Cattle on this landscape are work in a patchy way. They'll graze an area for a few days and then move on, and then over the course of a whole year, hit everywhere. In our plots, they spend a very small proportion of the actual hours of the year inside a plot. They'll spend a couple hours 4 or 5 times a year, and that, with 100 head of cattle, is the same as having a stocking rate of a couple thousand cattle over several thousand hectares of land. That's a normal, moderate stocking density. So it's unlikely that these effects of wildlife not, sort of in a sense, using these areas less is because of humans per se. Almost certainly it's because the cattle are changing the resources. And I just wanted to add that everything you've seen has been about how cattle affect wildlife, but we also have really good evidence about how wildlife affect cattle. I want to mention that one of our co-PIs is on this project is Dr. Wilfred O'Dadi, and he is like the cattle expert fundi in this system, and he has shown really clearly that wildlife do in fact reduce cattle weight gains. So the competition does go both ways.
Thank you. And the point that Duncan made earlier during his presentation, of cultures changing and livestock patterns changing, that's very relevant here. Kenya as a country and Laikipia as a county are under a lot of pressure to improve on food security, and livestock are a critical part of both our economy and our food security. So understanding these patterns is really, really essential as we go forward, so we can have food security, have productive landscapes, and have the amazing wildlife that we're so blessed to continue to enjoy and see in this landscape. We'll move on to the next question. The question I see here is from Megan McDaniels. How does the presence of elephants affect cattle weight gain, reproduction rates, milk production rates, and other desirable characteristics for pastoral people and ranchers? A detailed question.
Well, we like I said, Wilfred has shown that there are these effects on cattle weight gains for wildlife in general. What we haven't done is done that same question about this particular interaction between the three: wildlife, which suppress cattle, and cattle, which suppress wildlife, and elephants, which reduce the suppression of wildlife. But what effect that has on cattle, that specific cascade, Wilfred has not been able to tease apart. It's a much more subtle one. And I don't have an answer. Wilfred might, and we can certainly welcome him to chime in here.
Because I think Wilfred did show that there was a negative effect of wildlife on cattle, but that was mostly during the dry periods, right? And during the wet periods, they actually gained weight when wildlife were also present. Because and especially when zebra were present, because zebra, they get rid of like the rank grass, and then there is nutritious regrowth, and this is good for the cattle. So the cattle actually gained weight when wildlife was present.
Yes,
during the wet periods, right? So if you would take then a whole year, then maybe the wet periods and the dry, so the negative effect during the dry periods and the positive effect during the wet periods. So maybe overall there is no effect on cattle yield, like on weight gain and on weight and things like this.
I should have said that one of the most exciting things about Wilfred's research is that this competition, this suppression of cattle by wildlife happens mainly in the dry periods, and the wet periods it actually reverses because the wildlife actually freshen the ground. The grass. I do believe that dry outnumbers wet in these systems, and that the net effect will still be negative, but it's much more subtle and nuanced than the simple they compete with each other. Duncan, who might want to say something about this, who's been demonstrating the effects of cattle on wildlife, also shows a seasonal wet-dry difference that parallels the results of Wilfred. Duncan, you want to mention that?
Yeah. Again, one of the insights we got from this work is that, although I have emphasized more on the negative effect on from the perspective of wildlife, that wildlife are being suppressed by cattle, we realize that suppression is less severe during the wet season when resources are abundant. So that during wet season, you get less suppression of wildlife by cattle.
And for a couple, it actually increases. Like some zebra may actually do better with cattle if there's enough resources.
Yes.
Yeah, and our study, the study that I presented, we also looked at grass quality, for example, so nitrogen concentrations in grass, which indicates how protein-rich grass is. And we actually saw that in the plots where the mega herbivores were present together with the cattle and the other wildlife, quality of the grass was actually highest. And this was actually also supported by another study in Laikipia County by Felicia Kiesing and others, which was also published in Nature Sustainability in 2018. And they also show that if you have an integrated wildlife plus livestock management scenario, then forage quality was actually higher than if you would have only livestock or only wildlife on your savanna.
Thank you. And that is, again, one of the really unique things about Laikipia. It has amazing wildlife and an incredibly productive livestock system. We've got the questions pouring in, so I'll try and move through some of them. We have a question from Joshua Lauter about giraffes, and we've sort of we've answered that in a way. Are giraffes an equivalent mega herbivore? One comment I'd like to make there is that the reticulated giraffe, which occurs up here in Laikipia in northern Kenya, is an endangered species. The counts show that there's probably only a few thousand of them left. So that's one of the real challenges is, numbers of these animals, be they elephants, rhinos, even hippos.
Yeah.
We think of hippos as being very common. There are actually far fewer hippos across Africa than there are elephants. We'll move on. There's a question from David Kimiti, which I seem to have lost now. Let's move on. This is an important question here. We'll come back to that one. What effect does human-wildlife conflict have on this research and potentially implementing this research for improving the ecosystem? This is from Jamie Ben Felix. This is a really important question. And in so many ways, as the density of livestock increases and human populations are more settled, more dense, and land use patterns change, we have increasing human-wildlife conflict. And even here on Impala, where we have all this space and all this wildlife, our livestock suffers from human-wildlife conflict because we lose cattle to predation. We've even started to see elephants, who are normally quite peaceful, turning on wildlife. We had a camel that was killed, for example, the other day by an elephant. That's unusual. Most of the time, the elephants, the cattle, the camels all coexist. To our panelists, what do you think about that? I know it's a very big, open-ended question, but there's a lot we can do, and we do to limit conflict, and that work was pioneered here in Laikipia with predator-proof bomas. These are enclosures that keep the cattle safe at night from predators. But it looks like we're going to be in a landscape and a world that has more conflict between people, their livestock, and wildlife. Any thoughts?
Well, again, I'm going to defer to Duncan in general. I just, these kind of conflicts have led to this segregation of livestock and cattle. But what we're hoping to do with our research is show that there may be some pathways where one can find a middle ground, at least at moderate cattle densities. But there's many. We haven't even talked about disease either in both directions as another form of conflict. Duncan, do you want to talk about wildlife cattle conflict in a broader, writ large?
I think one of the things that clearly is, and we see this as an emerging trend, intensification in conflicts. We're likely to get more conflicts, and some of these conflicts are actually tied to land degradation. That with increasing degradation, overgrazing throughout the year, there's less opportunity for pastures to regenerate, and that means that a land that would have probably supported, say, 100 heads of cattle will support even a half of that or much less if it's degraded. So then you start getting issues related to just how much land is available for livestock. And again, the population is shooting. So all these factors kind of add to each other, feeding into increased conflicts, that there's more stocks available, and also there's increased degradation, which means for an average season, we'll get more and more severe effects for livestock, and hence the need to thinking about whether there is more grass in the neighbor's property and all that. And this, escalates conflicts.
So would an option be if pastoralists would maybe more if ranches would start working like together, right, to create a larger area so that your livestock is not as sedentary as they are now, so that pastoralists can be more mobile and like to make sure that they don't degrade certain areas, and also to have your mobile, so these enclosures where they're kept overnight, to also have those being mobile, because then you are enriching, if the cattle, they do most of their dung deposition and urine deposition in the bomas, if you can then move these along your savanna landscape, it means that you can create maybe more hotspots of nutrients, which can increase like grass quality and things like this.
I'd like to say two things. One is that we have people in Laikipia studying these movable bomas and their effects, and how dense can you make them, and whether or not how long that be in place to create hotspots of vegetation. And the work of Kari Veblen and Lauren Perensky and now Harry Wells are looking at that very question. Also, I think Dino might be able to address the former part of that, which is that there are increasingly now partnerships of sharing land seasonally between different landowners, in particular the large commercial properties and their adjacent group ranches, in just some of the ways you've described. Do you want to mention that, Dino? Some of the work that Wilfred and Dan Rubenstein are exploring.
Absolutely. We live in this complex landscape that has all these different land uses, but still has wildlife. And livestock really matters. It's the lifeblood, the life and soul of the people in this part of the world. So one of the things Mpala is doing, both in an experimental sense as well as in an outreach sense, is we've actually reduced the number of cattle that we own as a ranch, which has allowed us to increase the amount of grazing that we can offer to neighbors and communities and other people. And so getting the dynamics of that right and doing the science is a really important part of it. We've got a ton of questions pouring in, so I'm going to try. This next one is a great question, a difficult one. From Gasheru. Has the experiment determined the elusive carrying capacity of wildlife or livestock or both? That's a great question.
Well, I mean, carrying capacity is a wonderful theoretical construct. In places that are highly seasonal and more importantly, year-to-year variation, it's not even clear what the word even means. That there's some suggestion that you can kind of in a sense overstock for a while because the rains will get it back for you, and so that how you estimate carrying capacity is not clear. One of the things that we certainly are seeing is that at these moderate densities, which is kind of a way of talking about carrying capacity, we do see tremendous opportunities for coexistence. And in a sense, the wildlife are themselves telling you their own carrying capacity by their densities, whereas the cattle people can kind of push that over or under at will. But yeah, this question of carrying capacity in a highly variable landscape has been a topic of tremendous debate over the years.
Thanks, Truman. There's a question that's from Wilson Deritu. What exactly has led to increase in wildlife in Laikipia? I'll answer this briefly. First of all, people in this landscape love wildlife. They're willing to tolerate wildlife. They live with wildlife, even predators. The other part of it is people benefit from wildlife, whether that's through tourism, the facilitation we're seeing between wildlife and livestock, and a general feeling that the wildlife is something special. It's part of our heritage. It should be stewarded. It should be treasured. This does bring us to another comment and question which has come up here, which I think is really important. From Christine Lamana. In Kenya, we've already seen some lodges and hotels close in the wake of COVID-19 and the loss of international tourism. Could integrating livestock and wildlife help increase the resilience of local conservancies without the negative impacts on the ecosystem that many fear if we are sure to include mega herbivores?
Well, I mean, Dino, you might be able to answer that. Some of these experiments that are happening with the local conservancies trying to add conservation end. But of course, one of the conservation pays for itself is international tourism. And the future of international tourism is going to be quite tied into the future of biodiversity in East Africa, I think.
Absolutely. And to add to that, this is a complex landscape. And the other thing with wildlife and mega herbivores is we have to look at their population dynamics and where they move and how they move. And movement and connectivity in the landscape is one of the critical aspects that we are looking into. And so my suggestion is going to be we will have a future panel, and maybe we'll talk about connectivity and sustainability, because those are big questions. We have a question that's coming from Scarlett Magda of Vets International, one of our partners and supporters. And she says, are the pastoralists aware of the positive benefits of elephants? That's a big question, and that is an important question. And the answer is complicated. If you're a pastoralist and you see elephants and you love elephants, but elephants can also be a problem. And so through Impala has an outreach program called the Northern Kenya Conservation Clubs that goes out to schools in communities around Impala and does environmental education. To the bigger question of are enough people aware of the positive benefits of elephants? Probably not. And I think one of the challenges for scientists and for Impala and all of us involved in wildlife is how to better communicate that to a wider audience and a wider public. And this is a good first step. So sharing the science, sharing the discoveries is important. So we have a question from Robert Anguilla, which I think Duncan could take a stab at. Would fire effects completely replace elephant effects on carbon and nutrient pools in a system where there are no elephants?
Yeah, I'll try to respond to that. I don't think really in any way you could think of either replacing each other. We know although fire and elephant impact are analogous in many ways, or fire and mega herbivore effect are analogous in many ways, there are specifics to it. For example, in terms of just nutrient recycling, for fire is more immediate addition of nutrients, but only for a short time. Again, with elephant and dung, it's gradual process, and that affects, in many ways, nutrient fluxes in the soil. But in terms of the direct effects, I think both elephant and fire would have different implications in the landscape. Although the overall goal is that you'll have fewer trees and different rates of nutrient fluxes.
Yeah, so I think for nutrient cycling, it is a very different effect, because when you have fires, a lot of, for example, nitrogen and phosphorus gets volatilized, it goes into the atmosphere. So you are actually, there's a flux so your nutrients are basically disappearing from your ecosystem pools. While if you have elephants that are eating trees, the nutrients will come back into the ecosystem through dung deposition, for example. Or if elephants break down trees, then the pool of the trees will become smaller, but that pool of nutrients will go into the soil, so that will increase. So it will stay, the coupling in the ecosystem is much tighter when the animals are doing it. While the fire is doing it, you have a loss, which in the long term might actually also be depleting your soils, for example.
Just to quickly jump in there, Judith, a lot of questions are coming in about dung, and you are the expert on handling it. So can we use the dung? Can we change the way we spread cattle dung and slurry to replace some of these effects? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that is a good question. So the thing now is, of course, in savannas there are also a lot of dung beetles. So actually, the dung is quite distributed over the landscape. So of course, an animal you will have a dung pad, but once you have dung beetles on your dung pad, the area they actually move the nutrients also to different areas. So it is also very important that enough of these dung beetles and termites and basically fauna that lives off of dung stays in your ecosystem. And I think in terms of nutrient redistribution, we do know quite a lot about dung. So where does the dung go to? What is the spatial distribution of nutrients by animals that are feeding in one location and depositing their dung in another? But the impact that dung has on plant communities and on different plant species, there's actually not that much known about it. Only that dung is a fertilizer, so basically it will increase plant biomass. That is the main notion that people have. But what I am specifically studying is that nutrient availabilities in dung are very different depending on what type of herbivore has and what type of food has the herbivore eaten. So for example, if you have a browser such as giraffe, they eat very high nitrogen leaves from acacia trees. So their dung is relatively higher in nitrogen than phosphorus, for example, than if you compare that to a zebra, a grazer dung. And I now do experiments, and we actually show that certain plants respond better to high nitrogen to phosphorus ratios compared to other plants. And this is something that really also needs to be taken into account when you start looking at the impact that dung can have on plant communities. Which plant are you actually stimulating in growth? Because apparently grazer dung tends to stimulate tree seedlings more, and browser dung can actually stimulate grasses, which is also really cool because that basically means that there is really a very interconnected cycle, right, of browsers and grazers. Browsers are feeding on trees, but their dung is stimulating grass growth, while grazers are feeding on grasses, but their dung is stimulating the growth of trees.
I'd like to also specifically talk about these concentrations of dung that happen in these bomas, which is maybe a very particular issue. And what becomes of all that? There's two stories there. One is that those bomas, those corrals, when they're abandoned, retain their nutrient richness, which favors very palatable grasses, for instance. And these become real hotspots for ecosystem function that last for many decades. And in fact, some work by Fiona Marshall recently suggests that those echoes can last for millennia. The other thing that's happening, which is really interesting, is in pastoral areas, they're beginning to realize that this is a resource for them. And they are selling dung, by the ton to agriculturalists further south. Some of the work of Anthony Carigia quantifying that. There's this big transfer of nutrients out of these pastoral areas into the agricultural areas where, in reference to something Judith mentioned, there's actually a different value. Goat dung is worth a lot more money as fertilizer than cattle dung.
It's because there are more nutrients, I guess, in goat dung because they feed on nutrient-rich material. But when you say this, Truman, this is a negative effect for the nutrient balance of the savanna systems, right? Because they're basically then removing these nutrients from the savanna. I mean, they're now also removed from the grazed areas and deposited in these enclosures, which in the long term might have a positive effect, on because you have increased forage quality in these enclosures. But if you completely take it away from the ecosystem, yeah.
And that's something we were starting to quantify. So far, those numbers are relatively small relative to the whole ecosystem. But I'd also like to mention that nitrogen is always an odd one because it's not necessarily zero sum. That as you take it out of the system, there's also ways it's being brought in constantly into the system. And so nitrogen is always a little different than the other nutrients that way. Yeah. Yes, we don't really know the broader ecosystem impacts of this dung export.
That's great. Now, one thing I just realized is we are running over our scheduled time, which is great. And the questions are pouring in. We are not going to be able to get to all of them. We've got a few more minutes. So a couple of things. First of all, I just really want to thank our amazing panel. And this, for a first experiment in doing this has been been great, and we have so many questions. We will try and follow up with some of you individually, but I'd just like to make you aware that if you are interested, please subscribe to our newsletter on our website. We also have Mpala Live, which is one of the platforms where you can watch animals. It runs during the day. There's even a night vision camera now working. Please look that up, and we will continue engaging with scientists and panelists and many other platforms. It's wonderful that here we are, even though we are locked down and isolated, we're not really isolated. We're as connected as the elephants and the cattle. So please join me in thanking Truman, Judith, and Duncan. And in the couple of minutes we have left, I call on each panelist to have any closing comments that they'd like to make.
I'm happy to start. I would like to mention that these clay exclosures are not the only such experiments going on at Impala. There are 3 other sets of exclosures. There's these Uhura exclosures and run by Rob Pringle and Jake O'Heen and Todd Palmer. There's the Glade exclosures run by David Augustine. And now there's new exclosures coming up that Dino is very excited about. So we actually have, this is not the only such experiment going on at Impala. There's some really exciting things happening in other parts of Impala in terms of these exclosure experiments. I just want to finish with that heads up.
Thank you, Truman.
Yeah, just a quick addition to this, that really, in all these contexts we have been discussing, these interactions, we are really talking at interactions at what we think is moderate stock intensities. Mm-hmm. We haven't gotten to the point of pushing it further to the limit, and that's what we are seeing around us, that a lot of areas where there's being overgrazing and intensive manipulation of the habitat, things fall off the balance. So a quick caveat to what we are discussing here, it's really under moderate stock densities. Otherwise, under extreme intensive grazing, some of these things start falling out of place. So, yeah.
You do have now some subplots in the Cree where there is heavier grazing by livestock, right?
Yes.
So you will probably be able to say something about this in the future.
Certainly, yes.
Yes, we have been replicating very high grazing densities in subplots throughout the clay experiment, and those are beginning to be analyzed by a Laikipia native, Harry Wells.
So thank you again to all our panelists and to our incredible audience who've joined us from all over the world, and all the amazing questions that you sent in that we couldn't get to. Maybe for the next panel, we'll schedule 2 hours rather than 1 hour. And I'm sure you'll all join me in applauding our panelists virtually. You can feel the love across the planet. And I just want to end by saying, please, if you can, subscribe to our newsletter, join us for future panels. And in these difficult times, it is good for us to remember that we are connected by the amazing science here as Impala, the wider Impala family, our friends, our students, our scientists, and we're continuing to do good science in the field and run these experiments. They've been going for a long time, and our plan is to keep them going. So asante to everybody, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you for hosting.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.